This video is about setting up Visual Studio Code to work with Python in a WSL environment on Windows 10. So I've installed Visual Studio Code, but there are currently no extensions whatsoever installed. If I click on, so this is the File Explorer. This allows you to search for files, integration with Git and other source code control mechanisms, the debugger, and the extensions. And here's our settings icon. So let's take a look at the extensions. And I'm going to go to the funnel, which is a filter, and go to installed, and we see there's no extensions installed. Now what we want to do is we want to work with WSL, so it makes sense that there's going to be a WSL extension. And the first one that shows up is exactly it, Remote WSL. We're going to go ahead and install that. Now it's called Remote WSL because to Windows, the WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, is like a remote system. Let's go ahead and remove the filter, add it for installed, and we see we have one extension installed, Remote WSL. Now that's it for adding extensions to VS Code on the Windows side of things, because we're going to focus on VS Code development in Python on the WSL side of things. So we can go ahead and close this down. And I'm going to bring up a Windows terminal, which I installed previously as per a previous video. I have it configured to bring up Ubuntu colors and Ubuntu home directory, and that's my default Windows terminal. Let's go to projects, and let's make a directory, and cd to that directory. And this is how you would typically bring up code if you were under actual Ubuntu system or a Linux system. Windows knows that this code is in fact Windows VS Code, by the way. I didn't install VS Code under Ubuntu. I've only installed it under Windows. When I run this, it will go ahead and bring up VS Code, and it will do so with the directory that we brought it up in. Now the first thing we see here is this is way too small, so if I do Control plus, this is based on Electron, which is a Chromium-like web-based app framework. So if I do Control plus, I can make this much bigger and we can see what's going on here. Now I'd like to go ahead and create a Python file because that's what we're going to be working with, but we'll just start off with the simplest thing possible. And we're not going to worry about PyLinter at this point in time. I'm going to go hit Control S to save our file and ignore these messages for the time being. We're going to go ahead and look at what extensions are installed. And behind the scenes, it went ahead and installed the Python for us. I'm a little surprised that it did that, but it wasn't there before and it's there now. Sometimes I've seen this work in different ways. Sometimes you get a hint saying, please install the Python extension. Sometimes you have to search for it, install it yourself. If you were to search for it, you would simply type in Python. The number one extension that comes up with Python is the one you want. If you click on it once, you can see, okay, this has been downloaded 25.8 million times. This is definitely the extension that you're looking for. Let's remove our filters. And note that we see that this Python extension, because we're going to be working with Python on WSL, is installed on the WSL side of things. The other extension that works really nicely with Python, and Microsoft has done a lot of work on this, is Pylance. It's sort of like a linter, but it does more than that. Discuss what it does in a moment. Would you like to make Pylance your default language server? Yes, and reload. And now we've installed two extensions. This really is designed to work in conjunction with the Python extension, and under VS Code I highly recommend these two, as well as if you're working with WSL, this extension right here. So this is the minimum number of extensions necessary to get up and running in a nice and neat way with Python using WSL. So now I'm going to go ahead and do a few more configurations. These are optional. I think it makes the development a little bit more fun or easy for myself. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the gear icon, bring up settings, and I find that this GUI is a little bit difficult to work with. There's more than 1,000 different settings, and if we look at it without the GUI, if we look at the JSON is just the differences in the settings between the default and what we've got. And that's a lot less than 1,000. So I'm going to go ahead and change our default way of looking at settings by looking at, we're searching for Workbench UI, and scroll down until we see the editor uses the UI. So the settings are done in a UI-like thing. We want to do a JSON. So we click on JSON, close up the settings, hit the gear icon, hit settings again, and now we see our settings.json file. We zoomed 3 times, that's actually saved there. Our language server is Pylance, and we're editing via JSON. So this is a lot less than the 1,000 options available with the UI. Now I've got a settings.json file that I created on my Ubuntu machine, and rather than type some of these in and look up what they should be, I'm going to go ahead and bring up that file. Open file. I had it in my temp directory, and this is just being pulled directly from another configuration that I did. Now, you wouldn't know to do these unless you looked up on the web what it is you need to set, but it's also fairly explanatory once you see it. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab these ones right here. Control C, and I'm going to add them. Put a comma here, return, Control V. So what did I do here? I added an editor, font size, weight, and family, a debug console, font size, font weight, and family, and we note that this is in a lighter color, which means it's been grayed out because it's actually not a viable option. Not sure why, but it isn't, and it's nice to see that you get a visual feedback that this option actually does not apply to a debug console. And I've got font size, weight, and family for the terminal as well. Now I went ahead and installed Source Code Pro to my Windows machine and my Ubuntu machine, as it's a font that I feel makes source code look easier, nice and easy to read. So with these settings, if I go ahead and hit Control S, now when I go back to Hello World, it's a little bit larger and we get a different font. A couple more extensions that I like. Again, this is a personal decision as to which extensions you like the best. One is called Python Indent. So it turns out that when you're using the editor, when you hit carriage return, the return key, it doesn't really go back to the place you would think it would on the next line. Python Indent corrects that. So you just install it, and now when you hit return, things line up nice and neat when you're creating a function, or in this case we're looking at an example of a dictionary. So that's nice. Another one I like is called Code Runner. It makes it a little bit simpler to run your code. So let's look up Code Runner and install it. Now Code Runner requires a couple of settings, and they're actually not configurable via the UI. If you click on this, it would still try to bring up the UI, but there isn't anything in the UI. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the Code Runner settings that I went to a website. So you have to go to their web page and see what settings you might like to try. I like these ones right here. I'll explain them in words in a moment here. You can have a trailing comma, by the way. There's nothing wrong with that. So basically this sets up the Code Runner for running in Python, because Code Runner works for other languages. And this is the syntax for running the Python interpreter on the file that's actually in the browser that we're looking at. I don't want to see the execution message. I want to clear the previous output, save the file before run. So again, you'd have to know this in advance, you'd have to go to the website and figure it out. I'm just copying and pasting so I can save time on how this is configured, and this is one nice way to configure the Code Runner extension. And we see we've got a little bigger icon here. Let's go ahead and save our settings. Go back to helloworld.py. This is how it would normally look. Go ahead and run it. It's a little bigger triangle. And now all we see in the output is hello world. So it's a little bit cleaner. And go back to extensions. Let's click on the funnel, installed, and we can take a look at what we've got again. Code Runner, Pylance, Python, and in the other one we've got remote WSL. From this view you can see which one, which extension goes where. And as I'm installing extensions, I might as well install a couple others that we'll use in a later lesson for Docker. So let's type in Docker. The first one that comes up, that's the one we want. 5.7 million installs. And also we want the second one, which is Docker Explorer. And we're going to go ahead and install that. So remove that filter. And we see we still have the one under the local, which again refers to Windows. And everything else, all the other extensions have been placed under WSL. Code Runner, Docker, Docker Explorer, Pylance, Python, Python Indent. But again, the only ones that were necessary to use it effectively with Python and WSL was Python, Pylance, and WSL. I would like to show a couple of additional settings you can use for Pylance. This is just to get started on how to do this. So I clicked on the gear icon, and when I click on this, we're going to get the UI version, which is a little bit helpful. With an extension, there's not so many options, and sometimes using the UI can be easier than using the JSON. I like the JSON overall, but for an extension, sometimes UI is helpful. Let's remove this so we can see more. And what I'm looking for is the diagnostic severity overrides. What I'd like to do, you can see we've got, these are the errors, these are the warnings, and we don't have any informational messages. I'd like to add some informational messages. The way this box works, it's better if the add item is closer to the bottom here. Otherwise it won't work as well. So now we want to pick what type of error or warning or informational message we want to use. I want to go ahead and find report unused import, and I want that to be an informational message. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Add item. Report. I'm just looking at unused things at the moment. Unused class. And let's go through here. Report unused. This is a little bit hard to use their list box here. Unused function and unused variable. So these aren't errors, but if you want clean code, you shouldn't have any unused imports, classes, functions, or variables. So now I've set this up such that we can get warning messages. Let's say I went back to helloworld.py and I imported the system module, but I didn't use it. So Pylance automatically detects this as I'm typing and says, hey, I got a blue squiggly underline. We see no errors, no warnings, but one informational message. I can go ahead and click on that, and it says import sys is not accessed. So it's an unused import. So that's an idea of how you might configure Pylance. It's also important to show how we set the Python interpreter and how we work with Conda virtual environments or Python virtual environments. In this case, since I've installed Conda, Anaconda as per a previous video, I want to work with the Conda virtual environment. Now we see here, if I hover over this, it says user bin Python 3. So that's the system Python that was installed with Ubuntu 20.04 when I installed that, as in a previous video. You can check that out. I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and it automatically detects the Conda environments I've already created. So I can say I want to use the Python from my py38, which happens, of course, to use a 3.8 Python interpreter. I do that, and that's all there is to it. Now, VS Code is set up to use this virtual environment. One of the advantages of doing that, for example, if I go ahead and create a new terminal, it will automatically activate the py38 environment. I can verify that by running version, for example, and we see Python 3.8.5. And of course, we see it down here as well. Let's go ahead and use this environment to install a module that's not there. So if you were using regular Python, it would be pip list, PIP. Here it's going to be conda list. And this is what is installed by default when you create a minimal environment. I'm going to go ahead and add to this environment SQL Alchemy, for example. Let's say I was trying to bring in SQL Alchemy. Now we get a yellow message. It's not accessed by Pylance. We couldn't find it. If I was actually going to use it, we'd get more than just a warning. We'd get an error because it's not there. And, well, it doesn't know what to do, so we're going to go ahead. We're at the terminal, and it says we're in the py38 environment, which is what we want to be. So if I do conda install from here, it's going to go to the py38 conda virtual environment. Go ahead and install it. And let's say yes. And we've got it. If I go back up here, well, let's double check that we put it in the Python environment. Conda list. Let's go ahead and type it into grep for SQL. And we see it's definitely there. So this suggests that the environment in which VS Code was brought up in, it went ahead and checked what was available in Python 3. I bet if I reset this, we'll be just fine. It it didn't actually detect a difference. So if I change it and change it back, there we go. It changed from yellow, which was we couldn't find SQL Alchemy, to blue, which is, well, we're not actually using it. So what did I do after installing the module at the command line? I went to a different interpreter and then went back to this one, which caused VS Code to reread what's in that environment, and then it realized that SQL Alchemy is now a module in this environment. And that's the basics for getting started with VS Code under WSL for Python.